So as Olivia said, I'm Guy Julier. It's interesting that the next speaker is going to be talking about working with museums, presumably from the point of view of universities getting into museums. I work in a museum and constantly trying to get out of the museum. Yeah, and I have this kind of strange, well, rather nice job actually, because University of Brighton pay my salary, but I get an office in the V&A. So I'm surrounded by 18th century silverware. When I started there about 5 years ago, I was asked to give one or two presentations to other curators about my sort of view of the museum, particularly in relation to contemporary design. And don't say this outside this room, but I said, well, it's very nice, but it's a bit like Homes and Gardens magazine in 3 dimensions, as in it's full of really beautiful stuff in glass cases. You know, sort of has a very kind of consumeristic sort of view of the world, and how does it engage with, you know, issues like climate change, demographics, migration, all these kinds of really current sorts of issues. So I suppose part of my job in the museum is really sort of engaging the museum with these sorts of questions in various ways. And my sort of field, well, one of my fields, I suppose, is this thing called social design. And I wrote a definition of social design a while back, saying social design highlights design-based practices towards collective and social ends rather than predominantly commercial or consumer-oriented objectives. It operates across many fields of application, including local and central government, as well as policy areas such as healthcare and international development. So it's almost everything, really. So given that broad remit, I think we're going to be talking a lot, not just about social design, we're going to be talking about kind of research and policy in general, I think. And over to you. Do you want to say a bit about...
Absolutely. So I'm going to talk a bit about my background and kind of how I came to do this role, and a little bit about kind of what my role entails and kind of design policy in the round. I'll give you a very edited version. Basically, I graduated with an arts degree in 2008 into a recession, and it was just blackout. It was I really wanted to be a curator. There's absolutely nothing going on. So I moved back to Liverpool, where I'm from, and ended up working for a refugee organisation and working with kind of asylum seekers and refugees of recent status. And from that job, I actually came to work for an MP in London doing casework, and became a specialist in kind of housing and poverty and kind of welfare issues. But I was always really interested in design as kind of my first love, and I did a master's at the V&A and the RCA in history of design. I ended up kind of specialising in like industrial policy, so I'm really interested in manufacturing, how we make things, why we make things, and kind of what that says about us, and you know, how we can kind of look to the history of sort of how we've developed kind of our expectations and think about what that means for the future. Pretty niche, but that kind of led me to my job now. So I'm the head of a department in a think tank called Policy Connect. We're a non-profit, always kind of scrabbling around for finance, especially in design and manufacturing and innovation. So in my kind of parish, I look after 2 different all-party parliamentary groups. I know, sorry, I've forgotten his name, but the chap from History and Policy talked about the importance of kind of APPGs and select committees, and the idea of kind of getting MPs from different sides to sit in the same room and kind of agree on the same broad messages. That's exactly what we do as well. So that's really important about kind of design and manufacturing and industry. Also important to get kind of industry buy-in. I'll talk a bit more about that later on. I also manage 2 research commissions. So one of them is the Design Commission. Guy has helpfully brought along one of our reports. I think it's probably the one with the most policy impact. And I didn't write it, your PhD student wrote it, but never mind. Yeah, this is about design and public services, rather than kind of product design per se. And this has had quite a lot of policy traction, because there is now kind of a service design methods lab in the Cabinet Office. They use kind of, there's a room full of post-it notes, and people talking about kind of design and, you know, the diamond and all that kind of thing. So that's a really good example of kind of policy change. but maybe through kind of funding decisions rather than legislation.
That's really interesting, because interesting to hear that, because I was on the sort of advisory board for this report. It's called Meeting Needs, Saving Money, Humanising Services, Engaging Citizens, all that stuff which Matthew Turner was talking about earlier, I suppose. Restarting Britain too, Design and Public Services. Once Jocelyn had sort of written this report with some advice and so on, my feeling, because I used to go along to the House of Lords on Thursday mornings from 8:30 to about 10, and we'd have these evidence sessions where we'd invite people in from service design or local authorities and this sort of thing, working in public sector innovation, to give evidence. And it felt terribly abstracted. We were in this kind of bit like this room, this kind of wooden panelled room in the House of Lords, and I remember one classic moment, the chair of this committee expressed her surprise that so much innovation was going on in Cornwall, and you really felt you're in this kind of Whitehall bubble. Once we'd done this report, me with my usual sort of cynical view of these things, that, oh God, just a load of MPs are going to, you get this, flick through it and then chuck it in the bin. But as you say, it did lead to the policy lab being formed. How else do you think something like this had impact?
I think that came along, again, this is kind of slightly before my time. I came shortly after that, but I think, so the impressions that I've gleaned from that are that it certainly came at the right time for kind of the design press and for a lot of media. It was a really critical point in the policy cycle. So it was 2012, wasn't it? So austerity. How can we save money and do better for kind of citizens? That was a big theme, as it is now, and that's kind of I'm really reprising this kind of piece of this work now. Given we've had the spending review, the idea is how can we deliver better services for less? Given that kind of the majority of our public services were designed 70 years ago by men in rooms much like this, and for a public with very, very different expectations to today. And how can we really use design methods to create services that are more empathic and cheaper, rather than kind of twiddling at the edges, actually look at kind of the nature of that interaction. It's quite a fundamental question about sort of how we experience kind of care and access and payments, and kind of the nature of government itself, really, which is where kind of all the interesting stuff with GDS comes in. They're really pushing on the kind of government as platform stuff, which has the scope to be really quite fundamental in terms of policy and how we kind of think about government.
It seems to be like a glass half empty or half full situation, really, isn't it? Because you've got this thing about austerity, 40% cuts, to public sector budgets, and you've got frontline services being cut back and cut back and cut back to the point whereby they can't be cut back even any further. They can only survive really through their radical redesign, in a way. And whether you see that as social design in a sense, shoring up the cutting back of the state, and saving money and so on, or whether you see that this as a sort of positive moment to actually affect some really interesting change, is this sort of glass half empty, half full thing, I suppose.
And I'd also kind of say at that point is that something that's really coming through with design policy for me is that if you look at kind of health tech, the rise of kind of devices, various kind of interfaces with which we ourselves kind of manage these things rather than like a patrician sort of paternalistic view of the state. That really plays into kind of government ideology and is kind of cross-party as well. I don't think any Labour politicians would really disagree with the idea of kind of managing chronic conditions through design, better to save the NHS kind of a lot of money. I think something like 70% of the NHS budget goes on. I'm explaining this very crudely, but essentially kind of when people with chronic conditions like diabetes have to go to A&E, like cases like that, you know, things that could be managed better, but due to kind of the inefficacies of the current health system, you know, that's kind of leads to where we are. So yeah, it's kind of really big. Not just kind of not just sort of questions of technology, because the technology has been there for decades, right? But it's more kind of to do with procurement and the right sort of political appetite for these kind of things to come through. Yeah.
You mentioned that so much public policy has been designed for a different sort of era of government administration and so on, and you mentioned, you know, mostly by sort of white middle-aged men, you know, and that makes me think about, you know, I was thinking about all the different public policy research institutes there are in British universities. I looked these up the other day. For example, there's the Policy Research Institute at Leeds Beckett University, which is where I worked for 20 years. The Institute for Policy Research in Bath. There's the Public Policy Group at London School of Economics. And then there's these think tanks like the Institute for Public Policy Research, and then there's the Centre for Policy Studies. You know, it's a bit like sort of Judean People's Front or People's Front of Judea around these things. But, you know, what for me strikes me is that, you know, they kind of are very similar in terms of their age profile, their sort of approach to policy, their thinking about outcomes, in a way, certainly the university-based ones. And I remember seeing actually Patrick Dunleavy, who's from the London School of Economics, on telly, complaining that whenever he went to the Cabinet Office, that everyone, the average age there seemed to be about 23, and he was, you know, sort of, you know, this, you know, like me, you know, as a white middle-aged man, you know, with so much more knowledge and so on. And
at least he's on Twitter as well.
At least he's on Twitter.
Yeah, he's all right.
No, he works, Patrick. But, you know, I'm just thinking about, you know, this sense of, you know, this incredible kind of change and churn and trying to rethink the way in which public sector is designed and delivered and implemented and so on. Do you think this is sort of opening up new spaces for, you know, not the, you know, Policy Research Institute type, you know, white middle-class academic, you know, of 20, 30 years experience? Is there a kind of broader points of entry for, you know, people like the folk in this room?
I really hope so. I think my my slight kind of caution with you know, when we talk about policy, about public policy, it's a really new industry. So like think tanks and things, they are, yeah, this is kind of a new business, and therefore it is a very elite and elitist business. And I'd also kind of, forgive me if I've missed it because I've kind of been in and out today, but I'm not sure if anyone's really talked about funding today, and kind of following the money, like who pays for these researches and you know, things like that. I would really always kind of ask you to question them. So my job is to kind of, I have to go out and fundraise for, you know, 3 jobs, for, you know, numerous kind of events, publications, the wine, you know, like all those things, and that kind of puts me in sometimes, you know, like, you know, a position where I do have to like really consider and kind of really push back sometimes. I mean, something that has come up kind of drastically for me, although it hasn't really come to the fore yet, is I mean, manufacturing weapons are a key export of the UK, and BAE Systems are, you know, one of the 15 funders for the manufacturing arm of like our business. And, you know, I mean, what happens if they kind of offer me another kind of boost of money? You know, I know my boss would want me to take it because we're always looking for extra finance, but I would personally feel very uncomfortable about that. So things like that. So maybe sort of scroll back a little bit to your question about kind of new platforms for things. Yeah, I think absolutely. The funding situation is also really in flux at the moment. I'm working on a project with the Design Commission on behaviour and the built environment, which is a huge project, and it's being directed by by the Dean of the Bartlett, Professor Alan Penn. I don't know if anyone's kind of familiar with that line of work. but with kind of his approach to things, and Baroness Whittaker, and both of them have kind of very different takes on the built environment and kind of how huge it is. But something that's really come across in our evidence sessions is, how little funding there is left in local authorities. Basically, there's no planning expertise left in local authorities because of huge, really substantial cuts to the Department of Communities and Local Government. So they've had a 50% cut since 2010. So this kind of, evidence, so to make evidence-based policy for the government, there's no kind of research expertise left. So, and we have been able to actually call on some incredible evidence from academia, from kind of Salford and Edinburgh, Reading as well, and that's incredibly valuable, and that will, but they're basically kind of, I think someone earlier today sort of said that civil servants love it when you do their job for them, and I think increasingly now, and especially under this government, I think think tanks are kind of doing the government's job for them as well. And that's maybe not a good or a bad thing, but it is definitely a thing, and it does allow for kind of increased opportunities for engagement.
Yeah, I mean, I noticed a sea change around about 2008, 2009, I think. I was, until 2011, I was running an outfit in Leeds called Design Leeds, and we sort of undertook kind of consultancy and research work, really sort of locally and regionally based. It came from a sort of background within our School of Architecture, Art and Design, a very strong kind of community design ethic, a lot of work doing things like community gardens and leftover spaces, that sort of thing. And I really wanted to look at how we could sort of build this more into sort of local government approaches and so on. And it's really weird because, I mean, I set this thing up in about 2004 and 2005, and I seem to spend an awful lot of time kind of doing the networking and banging on doors and saying, look, we're here, we've got all this expertise and so on, and they just didn't want to know. And then suddenly, in about 2008, 2009, they were knocking on our door.
Interesting.
A real sea change. The thing I know, in talking about funding, the thing I learnt then was to always ask for money in March, because that's at the end of their financial year, and they've got little pots left over and so on.
You'll all be getting emails from me, so
yeah. And a project I sort of was involved in for about 2 years precisely did that. We got funding from the Regional Development Agency, as was in 2008 for 2 years, and then we presented our findings to them a week before the elections in 2010, and then a week after the government closed the Regional Development Agency down. But we still had our funding to run. So, I think one of the things to learn from that was A, yes, ask for money in March, and B, don't expect the kind of policy ground on which you're working to be the same policy ground when you start as when you finish, I think. And I think the third thing was, we produced this ginormous report for our funders called Margins Within the City, Social Networks, Underutilised Space and Undervalued Enterprise. It's a cracker. But I don't think anyone's actually ever read that report. But I don't think it really matters, in a way, because I think the networks we created and the encounters we had in the particular neighbourhood we were working in, the kinds of connections we made in local government, the kinds of ways we're kind of an activist outfit, really. We're trying to sort of think about what would a neighbourhood be like in a sort of post-peak oil, a post-financial crash world. And we started work on this, in fact, before the financial crash, and it happened whilst we were working on it. So, we're doing all this kind of work. As I say, the report wasn't as important as the networks we made, what we prototyped and played with and experimented with, I suppose, and the possibilities. And, in some ways, it's really difficult to evidence this, though. It's really difficult to evidence, like a conversation you had in a cafe with someone, or an idea which someone else has taken, or something which that someone has picked up maybe 3 years later, and so on. And I think Matthew talked about this thing of universities being really heavily loaded in this kind of world of metrics at the moment, and having to sort of demonstrate impact. And I think he's right to say, well, it's not so much about demonstrating this impact in a kind of metrics way. It's probably more important to demonstrate a set of values, I think, and how those values are then kind of played out and turned into certain realities.
Yeah, I think so. And kind of how that fits into your sort of portfolio as well. I'd say that as someone with oversight over kind of our design work and manufacturing and innovation work, I'm trying to really bring those communities together quite a lot to try and kind of get more designers speaking to manufacturers and vice versa. Design isn't, we will always kind of live in like a world of material objects. I'm a design historian, so I'm very interested in that sort of.
And I was a design historian as well. So,
I think that's all where we'll tell you everything you need to know about migration personally, probably if you kind of push back far enough. But that's kind of, those are the values that I kind of want to push. I'm trying to get a lot more kind of history into our work. I wanted to mention that I'll be working with, so there's a big project coming up called The History of the Welfare State, and that will be done, so the Active will be a partner on that, as will the RCA and the Science Museum, English Heritage as well. And that's a 5-year project. They want to line up, I think, 2 postdocs, 2 postdoc places with that. And the idea, my kind of interpretation of that is that I've been brought on to kind of think about critical history and thinking about kind of how these institutions were designed, how these systems were designed as well. Again, with the idea of it being designed by men 70 years ago, and think about what that tells us for the future. The future of the welfare state, which, as we know from kind of watching the news, is changing fairly rapidly, in quite a hostile kind of way. And we've got 4 years of this government, so good luck with that. But yeah, like these things are very much live, and I think it's absolutely crucial for academia to be involved. I appreciate. I think sometimes it's quite frustrating for academics. Sometimes I think my personal experience is that we ask academics to those evidence sessions that you mentioned. A lot of the time, it's just me, kind of like booking rooms and ordering biscuits and making sure everyone's got a cup of tea, as well as producing kind of briefings and making sure people are happy and comfortable. And and obviously I'm happy to do that, but sometimes that is not as rigorous as I would like. And I really struggle with that as someone from an academic background. Like sometimes I have to kind of come up with stuff really off the cuff. And I can do that because I've got a background in history, and I think history kind of allows you to sort of synthesize like quite complex sort of fields of expertise and kind of put them into one place. A little bit like Mark was speaking about. I thought you spoke about that quite well, of kind of the pressure of doing that. But it is not academia, and it's very different. It's not it's not peer reviewed. The stuff that I write would not stand up to peer review, but it is quoted by a lot of academics. So it's that weird, slightly uncomfortable situation. And if you do kind of deal with anyone in kind of think tanks, just bear that in mind. I'd say, because we think you're all great, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it is slightly held together with string. And that's not such a bad thing, because we can actually be quite provocative and make arguments to government and kind of work with MPs and help them say like quite strong statements in kind of the Commons, and that's a good thing. But it is, it's quite a sort of grassroots operation, I'd say. Yeah,
I mean, it's about those twin speeds, isn't it? Twin speeds of academia and the rest of the world. I ran a project about 18 months ago called Mapping Social Design, and what we were doing was it was a strategy project for the Arts and Humanities Research Council to help the HRC think about how they can support public sector innovation, design, social design, and so on. And we wrote this doorstopper of or showstopper of a report. I mean, in it, some of our recommendations were that academia needs to be more flexible in order to work with things like local authorities, NGOs, and so on. And the HRC said to us, yes, this is really interesting. Do you want to run some projects to try and test flexibility? So we ran some projects over this last summer, and Naomi was part of one of those. And guess what? We came out with the conclusion that academia needs to be more flexible and responsive and so on. I think there's an awful lot of work pushing the other way as well in terms of our own institutions to allow the kind of really meaningful kind of collaborations which could be going on.
I mean, you must see this as well, kind of, as because you've got a foot in either camp. In academia. I mean, academics are under increasing pressure. They have to hit kind of their metrics, their targets, their refs, and with more kind of instability in the workplace, more zero-hour contracts, all the rest of it. This. How do you ever feel kind of slightly uncomfortable, kind of asking more of academics, like asking them to be, to work in ways that they are not tooled up to do so when their resources themselves are diminishing? Yeah,
absolutely. And I think one of the issues is I mean, there's all kinds of research projects which are taking place or need to take place in crime or healthcare or whatever it is, but we also need to be thinking and researching about how do we create infrastructures which coordinate, for example, between academia and other organisations and so on.
Absolutely, And this is like an absolute, this is a dream for the government as well. I mean, private third sector academic collaboration, government as convener and not funder. This is really kind of something they're just really trying to push in every way necessary. And kind of the stage is sort of yours, and it's I know that's kind of quite a wishful sort of thinking thing to say, but certainly the messages that I receive, they're just so keen to kind of get more academics, sort of maybe with sharp elbows and kind of elbowing your way into these sort of situations where you can really meaningfully contribute to policy, because given the kind of lack of funded research within government, I would say is a really crucial time. Can I ask, I mean, from what we've talked about, what design is and kind of what design policy is, at least as we think, I mean, I know there are some design people, but does that kind of resonate with anyone else's discipline? Sort of, I mean, history is kind of my hobby horse, but anyone else? Anyone kind of working in sort of social sciences, about kind of systems design, anything like that?
One thing that occurred to me, and sort of answers your question, is how design, there's potentially scope not just for increasing collaboration between policymakers and academics or design academics, but there's almost a potential for more collaboration with academics and other disciplines in design, and I think it probably already happens. So as an example, I'm a social scientist, and I was doing some work with seafarers, for example, about cultural issues of, all sorts of things, sexual harassment and on ships and health and different things like that. And part of the solution of that project was involving health technology, which you raised, and that's obviously quite an obvious design thing. And I guess, speaking to Naomi and Guy, I've realised how often design solutions are part of. So my role in that was to do with was to do with the sort of interactions and the cultural aspects of how to address a particular issue. But part of the solution was a technological one. So if I were a designer, it would be quite easy to have a policy impact, I imagine. But my point is that often in other disciplines, whether it's history or anthropology or whatever, design can be part of the pathway to impact as well, and how we can maybe pair up more between designers and other disciplines. And I just wondered if people have examples in their own work, whether you're in education or in English, where you think actually that part of my work or my potential work is very much design-based, or not. But it seems to me that there probably is a lot more than we imagine that takes place. Does that make sense?
Well, I think that depends on kind of the discipline, like your field, and whether or not it's open to other things, or if it's very set and specific in its methodology. I myself, I can't think of any kind of new design elements.
What's your area?
It's fine art. So in theory, it should be really open to, you know, kind of new kind of design aspects. It possibly is. It's just that maybe I haven't necessarily seen it myself. I mean, you probably also know it because you said you were in art before. Or?
I did a history of art degree,
Okay,
but then history of design for my masters. Yeah. How about the design kind of corner? Are there any kind of insights from your work where you think, well, you know, this might be sort of design policy, like maybe they're changing regulations, you know, something about kind of product design, for example? We're doing a lot of work around sustainable industry and kind of designing for reuse and designing for remanufacture, and you know the kind of legislations that need to change to make us consume more responsibly. Is there anything from there that you're interested in?
It's all interesting, and it's and kind of desire to be involved. I would just perhaps add that I think just as somebody who designs. That kind of the problem framing portion of design absolutely needs other people. We can't just be designers. It requires that cross-disciplinary kind of endeavour. So, yeah, I think designers want to work with other people who will seek those relationships. I'm not sure I've got anything to add on.
I think something that's really coming up, and I think we'll probably be doing a piece of work on this next year, is about how sort of design thinking could kind of help change regulations, you know, themselves, because regulations are kind of historically and socially constructed, and you know, perhaps we just haven't designed the right process yet, and perhaps, you know, the regulations themselves need to change, and yeah, and that could be a huge kind of thing in, you know, government legislation. So, but that's quite general. Yeah, definitely. I'd be really interested to hear.
I think how you think about it in terms of your own discipline can be done in several different ways. Having finished this follow-up project to the Social Design Futures project, Lucy Kimball and I have just finished writing a report for this last project, and the project was really about setting up very interdisciplinary teams. So, for example, we had, you know, like someone from education, a linguist, a designer. Sounds like a, you know, beginning of a joke, doesn't it? They walked into a pub, but also someone from a local woodcraft folk and a youth coding club, and so on. These kinds of weird mix-ups of collaborations around projects. And it got us thinking about, well, what is the nature of interdisciplinarity in here? And we've been referring a lot to an article by Andrew Barry and two others called The Logics of Interdisciplinarity. And it's published in Economy and Society. And he very usefully, they usefully sum up interdisciplinarity in three ways. One is where you get this kind of equal meeting of disciplines. So, you know, think of sports psychology, for example, something like that. Yeah. Or where you've got, the second one is where you've got a discipline which is using another discipline in service to it. So in design, for example, we use this thing called design anthropology, you know, which is basically designers doing really bad anthropology, but most of the time, from an anthropologist's point of view, that is. And the third one, I think, which is really interesting, is where you're so pissed off with other disciplines that you basically go away and make your own. I mean, that's a really bad summary of it. But it's a kind of antagonistic sort of situation with a discipline where you kind of want to sort of break through into sort of thinking in some other way. And in a funny way, just thinking on my feet, I mean, you know, what Matthew Turner was thinking about, and you've been talking about this kind of shift in policy thinking. It is an antagonistic thing as well. Say, you know, the way we've been doing policy for so long is so out of kilter with the material and human world out there. We need to really kind of rethink this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's kind of a process that the government are just at the start of. Like, I think an awful lot is going to change. And I mean, for all our kind of harping on about how wonderful the Policy Lab is, you know, it's 2.5 people, and they got the funding through like a departmental levy, and it's incredible that it's still there after last week. But you know, it's a small scale operation, but the potential for it is huge, and I think they've managed to demonstrate at least $1 billion of savings. I think $1 billion. So far. So, you know, this stuff it lands really well, and to reiterate kind of what I said before, it is very cross-party, and yeah, like it's a strong cross-party message. One of the good things about working with the APPG is that, you know, you can get kind of you know, the MPs and peers that I work with, you know, they'll sign up on the same messages. So I work with Lord Richard Rogers, with Barry Shearman MP, who's a Labour and Co-op MP for Huddersfield, with John Howell MP, who's a Conservative MP for Henley, sorry, and then a few other people in the Lords as well, and you know, I draft sort of statements for them to sign and things like that, and you know, ask them to kind of, you know, sort of suggest questions for them to ask in Parliament, and for me, kind of the credentials of that is that kind of exists along party lines, because they all kind of have they all sort of believe in design and what design can do in Parliament. So yeah, it's a really, I think it's an exciting time, but also design is kind of everywhere as well. So like, obviously we're looking at massive investment in infrastructure, some really sort of revealing decisions made in the CSR about kind of infrastructure being protected, HS2 being kind of tipped to, you know, definitely get royal assent and everything like that. So these are big questions about kind of how we think about design of the future, and kind of how we can design sort of systems that are fit for the 21st century rather than the 19th.
Thank you.